alternative ways of thinking and knowing to what we've inherited from the Western European meal, which is highlighting the arts and ways of thinking of the East. I think it's worthwhile then sharing Dr. Ogunaiki's new book that just came out.
I didn't ask him to do this. No. Now that he brought this up, so one thing I will say, all of these. Oh, astaghfirullah. Bismillah. One of the things that's in common, that you see in common with all of these African Islamic resistance movements, both on the continent and in the diaspora, is the importance of salawat on the Prophet. When Al-Mami Abdul Qadir Khan formed, this was the one who led the anti-slavery jihad in Senegal in the 1770s. When he brought all the chiefs together to swear allegiance to him, he had them swear on a copy of the Quran, the Dalal Khairat, and the Ishriniyat, which, if you don't know, the Ishriniyat is an amazing work of poetry in praise of the Prophet by Al-Fazazi. He praises the Prophet ﷺ in 20-verse poems in all of the 29 letters of the Arabic alphabet, 28 letters and Lam Aleph. So it's a kind of complete alphabet of praise of the best of creation. So anyway, the book is about poetry, West African poetry and praise of the Prophet. But in all of these movements, the praise of the Prophet, in terms of poetry, salawat on the Prophet, are all vital to the spiritual health and life and energy of these movements. That's really what was animating all of them.
Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik Sayyidina Muhammad. There was something I actually wanted to just, if I can I make a comment? Am I allowed? Oh. Comment? I wondered if something he said that he had mentioned, if you guys really heard that as it relates to the 13th Amendment, and particularly Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik Sayyidina Muhammad, and particularly as it relates to the prison industrial complex, because there are a couple of things that we use on a regular basis that we actually receive from these prisons for profits. For example, Hanes socks, Hanes underwear, T-shirts, things that are very common in our marketplace that without recognizing it, we contribute to that. And I don't know if, we knew this, but when the current president came into office, investment into prison for profits raised by 45% just within his first week in office. And so in addition to when he mentioned the new complex that's come about in terms of ICE, that most people don't know that only 73% of those who are arrested by ICE never reach their home. Right? Only 37% of them reach home. So where does that 73% end up? They're the ones picking your strawberries, picking your bananas, working in certain fields on the borders, and amongst other things. So this free labor, we really have to, it literally is slavery. And most of us would think that if I was alive at the time of slavery, I'd be an abolitionist, where you're alive in the time of slavery. Right? So I just wanted to mention that.
Oh, that reminded me. Thank you. That reminded me of another comment. So on this school, that's sometimes called the school to prison pipeline, it's very callous. The way they determine how many prisons, how big and how many prisons they need to build is based on the results of a third grade test. Because they found if you don't pass this third grade test, you're going to prison. The system is set up such that some of us will be out, be free, quote unquote, and that some of us, and they know this from very early on, some of us will basically be enslaved.
And we won't get into some of the cultural implications of that third grade test. As he mentioned, that when a school, because it's based upon property tax, when that school is basically, it's underfunded by the government, so its level of resources in terms of how those children are being educated, so then when they take that third grade test, they're never going to pass at the level, let's say someone in a suburban part of America is going to pass. So, I mean, Allahumma salli wa sallim ala Sayyidina Muhammad. I just want, when we talk about institutionalized racism, we have to understand, like, this is not something that you think about at an adult level. This is something that really starts from ground level, especially even in terms of how, when children are born, how they're born, how they're treated into the hospital, how the mother is treated. From beginning, the institution of racism is something that is laced within our American culture. And it really is imperative that we become more knowledgeable about how that works to make sure that we are actively resisting being a part of it.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaykum salam wa rahmatullah.
Recently we've been introduced or to be very familiar with the Syrian crisis,
Yes.
Civil war, and a lot of immigrants, Syrian immigrants, reached to United States to support the brothers' point of view here. And the question at the same time, can we consider their immigration to the States as being prisoners? Because I can see that in my local community, that they are segregated in a certain complex, along with other refugees, such as Afghans, Iranians, Iraqis, all of these countries that, Yemenis, fought in civil war or survived civil war, and they ran or they escaped for their life. Do we consider these people prisoners or, slaves as well? Because honestly, I don't see them being treated like any average American citizen. The schools are low, the income is bare minimum, even though the community, the county or the state might say we give them food stamps, we offer them English classes for free, we prepare them to go into the workforce. I don't see that.
So, I would, and, Brother Oludumimi may completely disagree with me, but definitely in terms of, are they seen as less human? 100%. Is there an intersection between racism and Islamophobia? Absolutely. Does it play an effect in terms of their economic status, their housing, all of that? Yes. But in terms of, to compare that in terms of slavery, especially what we consider the mid-Atlantic, the transatlantic slave trade, I cannot consider it on that same level. And the reason I'm saying that is because there are a level of freedom, just even in terms of the freedom of movement, right? That we, even as Muslims sitting in this space today, that we could not consider ourselves in that same situation. And I think it probably, if you just Google some images of slavery, you might understand why I say that. Like, for example, if in your attempt to escape your slave master, the first one would be you would get a beating that someone would have to come sew your back together, and it would take you weeks, possibly months to recover. And the next one would be someone would chop off your toe. And the next one would be then they would chop off half of your foot for the attempt to leave from that slave master. So
And that exists, sister?
I'm not.
The equivalent today would be if what happens in prisons, the brutality that people face in prisons. So they're not chopping people's feet out, but they're putting them in isolation. Right?
Yes.
So if you mouth off to if you talk back to a correctional officer, if you insist that, no, you can't treat me like this, I'm a human being, then they put you in solitary confinement, which for most people, for pretty much everyone but the awliya Allah who are just with God all the time, it drives you insane. It drives you into.
Not to mention, there are multitude.
Many other ways.
If you look at the situation, what happened with Sandra Bland.
Yep.
Right? Or Natasha Cummings. Where basically, right here in Fairfax County, she was tased to death inside of her prison cell. Or, in the case where they would allow certain prisoners who are working, let's say, with those with those officers to beat them up.
Yeah.
So I would say there are some punitive situations, and it's really, I want to talk a little bit about this as it relates to prison, because our understanding of it mostly is, well, they've done some crime, right? So for them, like, to some degree, they might deserve to be there because, they're guilty of some crime. But we have to look at the entire system for how they got there. But in addition to, you don't go to prison for punishment. You go to prison as punishment. The fact of already being separated from your family is that within it, it's, right, is a punishment, is by itself. So the additional punishment that comes on top of it is definitely less than humane. And just to mention someone, I don't know if you, earlier I mentioned H. Rat Brown, who became Imam Jamil El-Amin, who went from being the leader of the SNCC movement, which is the Student Nonviolent Coalition. He was somebody that was like just a solid resistor, like just hardcore speaking truth to power. When he converted to Islam, they considered him more dangerous. And currently, he definitely is in prison for a crime he did not commit. So I just want to emphasize, although refugees are definitely treated as subhuman, there is an intersectionality between race and Islamophobia. But to say that they are the same as prisoners or slavery, I cannot say that.
Thank you for your question. I also think the bigger issue for me is not necessarily how they're treated in the United States, but the reason they have to be here in the first place. So why is it that everyone, if you're looking for a better life, just even peace, security for your family, enough money to lead just a dignified life, why do we all have to go to Western Europe and the US and Canada? Why is that the case? Why are these the places that are oases of peace and security and prosperity in a world filled with oppression and poverty? They're rich because these other places are poor. They're peaceful because these other places are war-torn. It's not an accident that we haven't had wars in Europe since World War II, or that the US and Canada and Mexico aren't bombing each other. Right? The bombs, when bombs fall in somewhere like Yemen, or in Nigeria or something like that, it's seen as that's par for the course. That's where violence lives. It's okay for violence to be there. It's okay for violence to be with those people. So it's the bigger question of why couldn't those people have a good life in Syria to begin with? And the larger geopolitical interests. Look, as long as Muslims keep fighting each other and bombing each other, Sunni, Shia, this and that, they'll be able to take our oil, take our resources, and continue the colonial project.
Intentionally, arming one side while arming the other, just creating conflict. In addition to, I want to just make one small additional, point about that, is when he says about why do we flock to America or flock to Western countries or flock to certain places, he said it, but I just want to emphasize it. The understanding of what does 400 years of free labor give you? What kind of beautiful buildings and what kind of beautiful landscape lawn can you build on 400 plus years of free labor that other countries have not had 400 years of free labor? So we just have to, as Muslims, we have to think about our attachment to all of that.
And the stones to build those buildings, and the pollution, the stones to build those buildings come from other countries, and they're not paid a fair price for those stones. And the pollution made by building those buildings, that doesn't show up here. The pollution goes there. In fact, France used to drive big boats full of garbage and dump it in West Africa.
We drive our trash to India.
Yeah, we drive our India and Indonesia. They've just now started.
Our country looks so beautiful. We're like, wow, how come other places smell so awful and they have so much trash? Well, we dumped our trash there.
Is that like biological trash or the industrial trash and
both?
Both.
All of the above.
All of the above. And that all of that is also just a part of it, because then there are people like, it's dirty here, it stinks here, I don't want to invest here, I want to go live a nice, clean, Lord have mercy. Yes.
I have one comment. One documentary that you could watch is The True Cost, which is really good, that talks about where all of our clothing comes from, and then the externalized cost of pollution and all those issues. But my question is, for our future kids, I already know that my education when it comes to these things is very minimal, and I feel like I know more than the majority of people that I go to school with. Like, what do we do to teach our kids? What resources do we have available to us?
We have to develop new curriculums. Our children will not, if we educate them in the same way we were educated, in the same institutions that we were educated, they will come out with the same ignorance.
And based on what kind of
That was, the time frame came out. It was prayer time. I was like, I just quick. I'm just sorry for that. No, I'm saying we have to develop. That as Muslims, that we have to develop our own curriculums. For example, there are a number of things, like there are a number of Muslims who sit on boards to develop, textbooks. But in terms of how we're teaching our children and educating them, this, goes back to why did Clara Muhammad say, I will die dead as a doorknob before I will allow you to educate my children. Right.
If you both can squeeze your memories to the best of your ability, what was one of the most famous spiritual speech or statements that Martin Luther King gave or said during his movement that ignited the Afro-American people or black people to gush into civil rights movements and,
So it wasn't.
I don't think it was necessarily a speech that did it. I think it was a number of things, and he wasn't the first of it. And I'm so glad he mentioned Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, because technically we look at, like, for example, Martin Luther King to be the father of the nonviolent movement, but definitely that's Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, way before Gandhi. But it wasn't I'm going to let you answer that one.
Oh, yeah, so they're already, even before Dr. King, probably for 100 years before Dr. King, there were this groundswell of movement for rights for people. One of I think the most important quotes about King that you don't get in the literature is that he says, I've been fighting, he said this to Stokely Carmichael, he said, I've been fighting so hard for integration, and I've come to believe we're integrating into a burning house. He said he realized the structure of America at its core was built on exploitation, and it was rotten. It was a house that was burning down because it was built on injustice. And that's why at the end of his life, he fought for economic justice. He was against the Vietnam. He was very unpopular when he died.
Threat to national security.
It was a threat to national security. He was against the international exploitation of people, and he was against the domestic exploitation of people.
In addition to his conversations with Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz were very influential on him. And so you see, for example, toward that last year of his life, you don't see him speak about Jesus in the same way. You see him even in those very last moments where he says, I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the other side. There are a number of conversations that's had with Dr. King that definitely speak to his level of influence by Islam, and particularly by Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, especially as he began to realize the challenges that were happening as a result of integration, because those African-American communities who were autonomous economically, who had their own systems of banking, who had their own houses, that they were actually losing their autonomy by doing that. But that's a whole nother conference. That's like, understanding what segregation versus integration versus what was the message of Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. I think we're looking for this kind of messianic, like what was the messianic message? Who is that one leader that can say that thing that will galvanize the people? But that spirit of resistance had been, as he said, it had been swelling over a period of time. So many times it was just about like even in the case of Rosa Parks, that was a whole plan, but that was about, let me present your oppression to you and then teach you how you can galvanize. So it was really a lot of the groundwork and grassroots organizing that was happening on the ground that really made the difference.
And the spiritual dimension of that. So to answer the question of education, the first thing we have to do is to get a proper Islamic education. So you have a proper view of yourself, a proper view of God, a proper view of what human beings are, and a proper view of the world. That in and of itself will help counteract a lot of the nonsense. But then also, you need to, from that perspective, from that foundation, you need to understand the social, political, and economic forces that we're facing today. But that one has to come first. That one has to come first. And all of these successful movements of revolution and resistance, like Bob Marley once said, it's a spiritual war. Because if you fight it any other way, you're going to have to fight it again. It has to start with this. God doesn't change the condition of people until they change the condition within themselves. It has to start with the spiritual foundation, and then on that you can build the social, the political, the economic. But the spiritual has to come first.
Sorry. If I were us, just to comment on what he said, if I were us, I would focus our time on Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. Because in Turkey, you can get a PhD on the philosophy of Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. There's a book that talks about the 7 levels of his transformation as a human being. And so what's significant about that is because here you have a man who then, once he understands the concept of Tawheed, there is this deep and undeniable, as Allah says in the Quran, "Al-awliya Allahu la khawfun alayhim wa la yahzanun," like that on them shall be no fear, nor shall they grieve. That's what we need. We need the people who are no longer afraid to stand up and speak truth to power. We need people who are no longer grieving what happened in the past or even ashamed for us to stand up. We need people who are willing to, when we look at what Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz stood for, I mean, in terms of this is an Allah-fearing man who then, once he becomes into knowledge of his aqidah and he becomes sound with his salah and his ibadah, when he takes that with what he understands about the social political understanding and how humanity must change themselves, this is the model we need. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless him forever. And just a statement he said, he said, if we're not careful, the media will have us hating the people who are oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. And that's what we need to look at.
I think there's a book you should read called The Politics of the American Hijab. I think that will kind of help explain to you what happens when women do in America come out and wear hijabs. What the violence against people, against Muslims in America is most often happens to women because it is visible for us versus a man. I think I'll give you a little bit of perspective. But my question is more related to you talking about Haiti and the Haitian Revolution. And I was a religious studies undergrad, and I had 2 professors in my department who they're both white men, and they were awesome. But they studied black religion. One studied Black American religion. One studied Black Atlantic, like the Caribbean. And when we talk about Islam in Americas, when they talked about Haiti, and we read these things, and you'll see Allah. And I mean, they'll be like, oh, well, they just pray to whoever they can reach, wherever source they can get. It was mostly Yoruba and Catholicism in Haiti. What do you think that disconnect is? Why? I learned more about Islam in Haiti from you than I did in my own department. That was with 2 people who studied Black religion. And then when we talk about Islam in America contemporary, we focus a lot on immigration coming in and then religion and violence, and it's I don't know. I don't think my professors realize that when you have 1 or 2 Black people in the class or 1 or 2 Muslims in the class and everybody else is white, and you focus on that, you're telling people, and you may not consciously recognize this, that Islam equals violence, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, and it has a long history in the United States. So, especially as a professor, how do you mitigate those things? Because my department is all white, with 1 female, 1 white female, and I just want to know, how do we change the conversation around Islam?
So this is one really important point that you brought up, and I wanted for us to understand the same reason about how we got certain narratives about Black people, they're lazy, they're this, happened as a result of what would be considered resistance, right? So I'm not working for you. Then basically we spread, they're lazy, you have to beat them. I'm not learning from you, they're stupid or they don't want to learn, and so forth and so on. Because Islam was a reason why people resisted slavery and colonialism, this also began that narrative from then that Islam is violent, right? Because then it served the purpose of saying that they are subhuman, right? They are violent like animals. So therefore, we have to, they warrant for us to be over them. And so that narrative is something that's not new. And it's not new in academia as well. And so until we begin to bring in other academics into the conversation who have knowledge, about this, also from some of the origins of West Africa to understand the Imam Makandao, and then other academics, then we begin to bring that into the conversation. That's the one.
So I think it's also important for us to note that in Haiti and both Haiti and West Africa, Muslims weren't the only ones to resist colonialism and slavery. So in Haiti, the ceremony that kicked off the Haitian Revolution was the Bois Caiman ceremony, which involved Dati Boukman, but also involved the voodoo priestess. Vodun is derived from a combination of traditional Congolese religion and Yoruba Fon Ewe tradition. So there were religions in Africa before Islam. God said we sent prophets to every people. The remnants of those prophecy are there, and they're still there in West Africa, and they're still there in Brazil. They call it Candomblé. In Haiti, they call it Vodun. In Cuba, they call it Santeria. These are religious traditions too. They're all monotheistic. There's all one great supreme God. And so this is what I studied. Muslims were often leaders in resistance, but they weren't the only ones who resisted. The Malay Revolt in Brazil, the Yoruba and Hausa Muslims joined with people who practiced indigenous Yoruba traditional religion to fight them. So Islam has had an incredible presence on the African continent. It's the first Hijrah was the African continent. But it's not the only religious tradition there, and it hasn't been the only source of resistance to anti-black oppression. What happens, for many reasons, another thing you have to realize about academia is this is not a school founded by Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba. This is not a school founded by who founded these schools? I teach at University of University of Virginia, which was founded by Thomas Jefferson, who enslaved members of his own family, his descendants. Right? These schools are not our schools. They're not founded on the principles of our intellectual tradition. They were founded for us. So you have to understand, when you're going into academia, you're not going into a friendly, welcoming space. You're going into an institution that was founded on an intellectual tradition that's distinct from yours. That's different. And so you just, alhamdulillah, now there are some good people who have managed to infiltrate academia and do good work in there, and to try and broaden the kinds of knowledge that are being taught there as well. But you can't expect the teachers in those kinds of institutions to give you the knowledge that you need. Alhamdulillah, there are some there now. There are others of us who are trying to do that. But academia is not a neutral institution. Western academia is not a neutral. It's not like going to Azhar or Qarawiyyin or any of these institutions. It's a different intellectual institution founded on a different intellectual tradition. But inshallah, Rudolf Ware, if you haven't read his books or seen his YouTube clips, I can highly recommend him. There's several other scholars now working in academia.
Usman Khan.
My advisor, Usman Khan. There's several people who are doing incredible work in academia now, from this position in academia, within academia, to put out real knowledge about Africa, about Islam, about the convergence between the two, and the incredible legacy it's had in this country.
I think your question, if I make sure I understood, that she was saying that it's not just that she hasn't been introduced to Islam was a part of that revolution at all, right? That it was only voodoo that was a part of that revolution. And so I think you understand that there were a number of not just voodoo, but other, as he mentioned, traditional African religions that were, a part of that. But you're interested in knowing, where can I find more information where there were Muslims who were a part of that? Sylviane Joff.
Into the academia, because it's like obviously this is a very new field for a lot of professors. To even have a professor at a college that teaches that is, undergrad is amazing, but just like the integration of Islam more, especially in the United States, when up to like 30 to 40% of the enslaved people who came here were Muslim, and it's just like a footnote in the book, and then we focus on these other things a little bit more. It's like, where's that representation? Especially when most of my classmates are white, because I didn't go to HBCU. And like, just the message that the professors may not, they think they're helping them to decolonize their mind, but like I sit in a classroom with them and I studied abroad with them and I see the disconnect that they're, obviously not going to be like that from a professor, but I'm a student with them. I see the disconnect that is happening with them, how they separate themselves from these things, and I just like a way to integrate it more into the curriculum where they recognize it's Islam, and especially Black people and Black Islam in the Americas, right? So I just, especially since you're a professor, like I don't know
how I do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I teach different books than maybe were in your thing, and then I also tell stories. So there's stories about Dutty Bookman. There's a little bit of literature about it, but a lot of it's oral history and oral tradition. But our oral history and oral tradition is not nothing. It's not just stories.
Yeah. And we talked about him, but I didn't talk about him as a person.
Why do you think they call him Bookman?
Russ was bookman. Books, a lot of books.
No, literally, they call him Bookman. And I tell them, look, I don't know this for sure. These are the oral traditions. These are the records. This is the arguments for this.
But more and more, we're having more and more evidence come forward. Sylvia on Jope is one. Can you think of another one that talks? I'm thinking about Muslim revolts.
Michael Gomez has a book, Exchanging the Trump. So what I'm saying, there are a number of new books and more scholars producing works like this. But so, for example, when I was in high school, my world history class, we weren't going to cover Africa at all in my world history class. All right, so I said, no, this is a travesty. You can't do this. No, we talked about the pyramids, and then that was it. That was it. So I was like, we can't do this. Like, my grandfather would kill me if I didn't stand up and say something. So I said, no, and the teacher was like, okay, well, I don't know anything. I don't have the training for this. It's not in our textbook. Can you do it? So I said, sure. So I went and I got books and
You paid for that.
Yeah,
You paid for that class.
I got people. This was in high school. I went to public high school, so I paid in other ways, but not. But so I taught. So it's unfortunately you have to recognize that the educational system that we have here in the States is not designed to serve us. It's not designed to serve us as Muslims. It's not designed to serve us as people of color. It's designed to mold us in a particular way according to a particular model, which is not the model of our tradition.
In order for you to be in servitude,
It's not. They're not trying to make you walk in Qur'ans at University of Virginia. That's not the goal of University of Virginia. Right? So you have to make it incumbent upon yourself to find the education, to find the knowledge where you can. It's my job as a professor to try to integrate that as much as possible, but there are still limitations even within that institution. So then you have to go to other institutional frameworks and settings to do that. You can't get a proper Islamic education at an American university. It's not set up for that.
Yeah. Are there institutional frameworks that you suggest to make our kids vote?
Tuba is a really good one.
Tuba's
a great one.
Tuba's great. There are a lot of, it depends on what in particular you're looking for, but there are a number of good educational institutions that are still run in the traditional model. Whether they're Quran schools, whether they're schools that teach Arabic, they're schools that teach fiqh, but they're schools that teach the whole person. In fact, a lot of what goes on at this school isn't necessarily so much about what you memorize or what you learn, but about the adab that you embody. So the thing about being a walking Quran, the way you carry yourself, just your reflexes in interacting with people. Yes, you're memorizing the Quran, and that sanctifies your whole mind and your being and all that, but the person you're learning the Quran from, it's about the people. The thing about traditional Islamic education, which unfortunately has gotten lost a lot of the Arab world when they tried to modernize, but it still remains in West Africa. You send your son or daughter to learn with a sheikh or a sheikha because you want them to take on the character of that person, because that person's character is the character of the Prophet. And the Prophet's character is the Quran.
That's why I asked, because I know that you can send your child to memorize Quran, but that doesn't really mean it will do anything.
You have to find really a sheikh or sheikha who's a sheikh of tarbiyah, who embodies the prophetic model, the sunnah, the character of the Prophet, and who teaches and trains children, or the closest equivalent. And you do that yourself as much as possible.
In addition to, there are some programs I want to I want to emphasize, like, there are a number of programs, particularly, especially within the West African tradition, that are meant to build what's called insan and kamen, right? The complete human being. And so, for example, even teaching, about when you're learning about the stars and the planets, understanding how does that relate to you? And then how does that relate to science and mathematics? How does that relate to how are you going to understand this, microscopic thing? Or how are you now going to apply that and build, something in this particular village or in this area? I think I don't want us to look at, because this is actually began to happen in what we call the modernized Islamic understanding. We begin to do kind of like this specialization in a way that began to separate Islamic studies from academics, without saying that even in learning academics, that was a part of how do you serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this dunya? How do you become the Khalifa of the earth? By understanding this. The problem is we learned all of this and did like Quran on the weekends, and we took this as the most important thing, and like this was like a secondary thing, or people did this and then they had no application for this. So when in reality, this is all this is all integrated studies. At least that's what it used to be. And so how do we come back to that Timbuktu Sankor model is something we have to work on. I have to pray Salam to Isha. I'm going to let him, you go, yes, Bismillah.
I just had one quick question. You had me on the same page philosophically until we got to the voodoo part. So I'm asking this not only on my behalf, but also for anybody who's going to watch this on the internet for clarification about that. Because my understanding was that just, for example, the Aztecs, when they started human sacrifice, that's very different from the North American Plains Indians. I mean, they never had human sacrifice. So there's deviations that are possible in these shamanic or, other traditions. So voodoo, and I mean, I had students who have gone to Haiti, for example, and their uncles or relatives are exorcists, and they've seen stuff go on in voodoo that is just like wild. I mean, it's, so can you kind of clarify what do you mean when you say these voodoo elements?
The religion is Vodun in the proper pronunciation of it. So like I said, it's a combination of traditional Congolese religion and Fon Ewe, which is a group closely related to the Yoruba people. Like any tradition, just like we have Uluma Khariba and Sihr in the Islamic tradition, you can do all kinds of nasty stuff to people. You can do that same stuff in voodoo. But the purpose of Vodun, if you talk to any Ungan or Mambo, priest or priestess, they say is to live your life in accordance with le bon Dieu, with God, with the will of God. They believe in one God. They have these different loa who are like angels or prophets or something like that you try to follow. But the origin of the practice is submission to God.
I see. And it's
developing good character. But just like anything else, you can have deviations. And when you have these kinds of occult knowledges of how to do things, you can do terrible things with that. But Vodun, for some of the same reasons that Islam got a terrible rap, voodoo has a horrible reputation in the West because it was a very powerful. People would do voodoo spells and things on the masters. The whole zombie thing was a way of making someone living dead so that you would zombify the master so that you can live easy on the plantation.
Really?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of prejudice about voodoo built up in the West.
And part of that also is when I need to make you seem subhuman and animalistic, everything about you
and your culture
and your culture and your beliefs and everything about you is subpar, right? Your religion is subpar, your beliefs are subpar, your understanding is subpar, you are evil, you are bad, everything, especially when we're talking about black people, to be honest, everything about you is bad, right? Is wicked. And so what that does for people is then saying, I have justification.
Exactly.
Right? For why I should imprison you, why I should put you in cages, why if I'm not in control of you, you will go wild into your beliefs. And so, again, the same kind of the ways that we see Muslims being demonized and Islam being demonized, that is definitely true amongst, people of the African diaspora. And I just want to, kind of emphasize this point, because I don't think that we fully know this, is that when the Prophet ﷺ begins to tell us about who are the masters of Jannah, who are the masters of Jannah, and he mentions, Luqman, right? And there's a reason why when we get into why the first, and we don't have time for this, but why the first migration is into Abyssinia, right? Why the Prophet ﷺ, they put Bilal on top of the Kaaba. This is literally from, in that understanding of mentioning Luqman, it literally is from East to West Africa. The Prophet ﷺ, even in following his sunnah, there's this prophetic eye of being able to see not only the situation that you're currently in, but the problematic things that are going to come into the future. And so, like, for example, we, for the most part, have a view that everything, and I know every history book I ever read told me that every African religion was animist, that they were all animist, right? And so are you telling me that every other people had a Hanafiya-based deen, but no prophets came to Africa when most of the Quran takes place in Africa? Idris is from where? Africa. And even the migration from Yaqub, from the Yaqub and his tribe, when they come into Egypt, they come from a more centralized area into Egypt. Right? We don't even discuss, like, where was Yaqub before that? We don't even think about Central Africa at all. That how did the people of Mali, how did they come up upon this rich tradition and understand Islam so thoroughly and so rich and so much history so fast? Because there were people Hanafiya before that. Right? They didn't just, like, it wasn't just, in terms of looking at the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we know he's the last prophet, but there were many Anbiya before him, right? And Allah says, I sent one to every nation. So for some reason in our mind, Africa, I don't know, they weren't God blessed at all. Like, really, they were just animists, and then Islam came. But that's not even what the Quran says. Right? The Quran doesn't say that, to be sound.
Yeah, whenever the prophets needed a refuge, they went to Africa. Even the story of Jesus and Mary.
Yes.
When they go to Africa. And I always joke with some of my friends that when some people get to heaven, they're going to think it's a bad neighborhood. I know how many African descended atheists do you know? To be honest, the last people to give up religion, despite everything that's happened to them, are the people of Africa and the diaspora.
Yeah. That even when it's like, when other people would be like, where is God? These people are like, Allah.
They're calling on God to help. And they're calling on God to help in the ways that were given to them by the prophets that were given to them before.
Yeah, and I really wish that this is something as Muslims we begin to examine, because we have carried on that colonialist idea that everything African is pretty much bad, backwards, ignorant, or animism.
Yeah. Now, and I didn't mean to imply that at all, because I've studied the North American Plains religion, and I understand that there are, like, the Aztecs went, they deviated from the original tradition, and it's just that the same thing. The older the tradition is, as you pointed out before, you kind of get more and more room for deviations to occur. And
but the thing is to say whether or not a deviation is going on, you have to do a lot more research and intellectual work than anecdotes.
Yeah.
Most of what we get are anecdotes and very, very biased, intentionally biased.
Right.
Things that are either colonial, racial, or Christian propaganda.
Right. I see.
Or information about African and Afro-diasporic religions.
Right.
it's what I study. So I've spent time with people from these communities.
Yeah.
And they're righteous. They're very righteous people of excellent character amongst them.
Alhamdulillah.
I think, again, we have to address our implicit bias. I know for Yusuf, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta wa nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase us in ilm and knowledge. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala remove every form of hypocrisy from our hearts and our thinking. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us amongst those beloved to Him because we have pure hearts. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us firm upon the knowledge of the Quran and firm upon the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Salamun al mursaleen. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Allahumma barik fikum.